So, a friend of mine used to imagine that she'd married somebody else. She imagined a man who would surprise her with thoughtful gifts, who would reach for her hand in public, and who made her really feel pursued and desired. But the more that she imagined him, the more convinced she became that she'd married the wrong man. And on her loneliest days, she told me she'd fantasize about what her life would have been like if she'd married somebody completely different. I told her then, and I'm even more sure of this now, that she wasn't alone. Because honestly, how many of us have never compared ourselves or our marriages to someone else's and wished that things were different? I know for me, I could relate. Many times I'd close a romance novel wishing that I'd been swept off my feet, just like the heroine in the story. Or I'd log onto social media and compare my life to the exotic vacations and sunset kisses that filled the feed, right? The carefully curated highlight reels of other people's marriages. And it's amazing how quickly comparison can convince us that everyone else married the right person. So many years passed before I saw my friend again. And the first thing I noticed when we got back together wasn't her new hair color or her new wardrobe, but it was the sense of peace that she exuded. The restlessness that I'd remembered back when she was considering divorce was gone. And as our conversation naturally turns towards our relationships, she shared with me that her marriage was in a really great place now. She told me that she spent the first half of her marriage looking for everything that was wrong with her husband, and she decided to spend the second half looking for everything that was wonderful about him. When I asked her what she'd found, her eyes completely lit up, and she told me about all the beautiful places she'd traveled in recent years. She'd been to Italy and France and Spain, and now here she was visiting me. And she smiled and told me that she felt so blessed to have a husband who supported her in pursuing her dreams, and that she could see that really all he wanted was for her to be happy. And then she went on to tell me how he was such a hard worker and such a wonderful father, and that he really supported her, and that he was so kind and thoughtful and generous. And I told her, wow, it sounds like you really hit the jackpot. And this was such a different story from the one that I'd heard years before. And she looked at me as if she had been reading my thoughts and said, I know, I know. She was singing a very different tune now. And she told me that when she had been focused on everything that he wasn't giving her or comparing him to other men and other marriages, she was miserable. But now she was the happiest that she'd ever been and felt even more in love than before. And I knew exactly what she meant because I'd experienced the same thing. There was a time where, years ago, early on in my marriage, where I'd scroll past candlelit rooftop dinners and pictures of these extravagant date nights and feel like I was missing out, feel like I'd been gypped. And I remember there was this distinct evening where my husband had packed a bottle of wine and some sandwiches and this old blanket and invited me to sit with him by the lake and have a little picnic. And I know that years ago, I would have thought to myself, this isn't romantic enough. This isn't a rooftop candlelight dinner in the city, right? Uh, but instead, I remember thinking, wow, this is actually so sweet. This is so romantic. I'd stopped measuring my marriage against someone else's and the social media highlight reels, but not just that, the the things shared between friends in confidence, right? The things that I read in books and romance novels. I just stopped comparing my marriage and holding it up to others and started enjoying the one that I actually had. And the more that I did that, surprisingly, the better and better things got. And so I've come to believe that the quality of your marriage isn't determined only by the person that you married, but it's also shaped by the stories that we tell ourselves about them every day. My friend's husband hadn't transformed into a different man, and mine hadn't either. But what changed was the lens through which we saw them. Every single marriage on this earth has shortcomings, and every marriage has treasures. And the question is, which one you're training your eyes to notice? We see our lives through the lens of the stories that we rehearse day after day. And over time, those stories become the marriages that we experience. And maybe that's why changing a marriage or shifting and transforming a connection in a relationship sometimes begins the moment that we become curious enough to ask ourselves, what story have I been telling myself about the person that I married? Really, comparison really is the thief of joy, in my experience. And what we focus on really, really does increase. And it's so interesting because our brain really is wired to constantly filter information. It's like that common, we hear it said all the time, right? If you buy a red Honda, suddenly red Hondas are everywhere. Not necessarily because everybody now has a red Honda, but because that's what our brain is filtering for. And our brain filters our marriage the same way, right? If at some point my brain decides my husband is selfish, guess what? I'm going to start noticing evidence for that right and left, right? If my brain decides or what I start to focus on is, my husband doesn't care, then it's the same thing. You'll start noticing evidence for that everywhere, right? And even, if your brain decides nothing is ever going to change or nothing ever changes, then that's the evidence that your brain will filter for. Those filters don't necessarily represent the whole picture very often, right? It's just what the brain collects, what we're collecting evidence for. And we always get to decide the case that we build, the evidence that we're building a case to support. It's like our brains are objective cameras, right? They're trying to make meaning out of everything that we see and process. And in my experience, when I am, and the wives that I speak to are so focused on the negative, we often miss the rest of the picture, which often contains some really beautiful and positive things. Sometimes I'll hear a woman say to me things like, oh, he never changes, or he's lazy, or he only thinks about himself. And then when she starts to expand her lens and her perspective of him and starts looking for the positive, all of a sudden she realizes that there's whole categories of really beautiful, positive ways that he's contributing to the relationship and to the family that she really had been missing and not focusing on. And when she starts focusing on those things, by acknowledging them inwardly and also for appreciating them outwardly, that the good starts to pile up and things start to get better and better in the relationship. Different stories create different marriages, right? There could be two women married to the exact same man, right? So there might be a husband who works really long hours, maybe even in a job that he hates because he wants his family to be well taken care of. This same man might rarely buy flowers or romantic gifts, but he fixes things around the house to make sure that everything is functioning properly. Again, he wants things taken care of. But again, this same man maybe isn't very verbal or expressive about his emotions. But the same man never misses your kid's soccer game. right? One wife might say, he doesn't prioritize me, or he doesn't care. And another might say, he sacrifices every day for me and for our family. Same man, different marriage. Not because necessarily he changed, right? But because the meaning and the lens changed. And we really do experience what the lens that we see things through. How much of what we envy is actually real? How many Instagram husbands are wonderful photographers, but we don't know the rest of the story? Maybe, yeah, we just don't know. And I know for me, worry or thinking about and imagining other people's relationships is wasted energy that is much better used taking amazing care of myself and investing in my real connections and real relationships. When we compare someone else's highlight reel to our real life, it's a recipe for disappointment, and disappointment that's just not worth it. If I tell myself, for example, I'm married to a selfish man, then eventually I can easily become the wife who's married to a selfish man, right? Because it creates identity, right? How I speak, how I interpret things, that all of that impacts how I respond and what I expect and what I notice, which all of that contributes to the reality that I experience. Eventually, the stories, the marriages that we have reflect and fit the story that we tell ourselves. And that changes our behavior, a behavior that's going to continue to feed the story that we're telling ourselves. It becomes a cycle that feeds itself. Now, of course, there may be things in a relationship that do need to, yeah, there might be things that are painful. There may be things that are challenging. So that's not to say that there isn't, or that those things eh, don't need to be addressed or processed, or, um, but it is to say, I think so often it does such a disservice to a relationship to when we just see the bad. And if we take a step back and see the whole picture, there's often so much good that's being missed as well. And so, if you're open to it, I would love to invite you to just take 5 minutes, or maybe less, maybe just 1 minute, take a sheet of paper and just write down, what are the stories that you've told yourself? Maybe it's he never listens, or he doesn't care, or he's lazy, or he takes me for granted. And just write down what else could also be true about your relationship. What are some things that could have previously been missed when you were focused on the negative or the painful things, right? Maybe he works hard, or he shows his love in different ways by fixing things around the house, maybe. Maybe he's patient with the kids, or he always comes home. I don't know. What is this for you? I invite you to write down, what are some positive things in your relationship about him. What if your marriage isn't only waiting for your husband to change? What if it's waiting for you to see something that you've stopped noticing, or maybe not noticed yet? And what if love isn't only found in grand romantic gestures or romantic novels that I love to read? What if it's quietly showing up in the way that he always takes your car to be repaired, or takes care of the bills or tucks the kids into bed, or an ordinary Tuesday where you just flop on the couch and watch a show together and just melt into each other, right? What story have you been telling yourself about the person you're married to? And what highlight reels, so to speak, right? It could just be the neighbors or the Joneses. Have you been comparing yourself to? And is that comparison serving you? Thank you so much for tuning in to Softening Into Love. I'm Laura Amador, relationship coach for wives. And if you would like support in transforming your marriage and making it one that feels joyful and deeply connected, I do offer private coaching. So you'll find the link to learn more in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, keep softening into love.